Hace aproximadamente un año hacíamos una publicación en Innovasque de un libro titulado Modelos de dinámicas de gestión basadas en personas, y ya por entonces distinguíamos cómo en el mundo había un estudio que había calculado lo que era la inversión empresarial en una serie de denominados activos intangibles de innovación. Y no solo se había calculado esa inversión en intangibles de innovación, sino que se había calculado sobre todo su impacto en la productividad del país y en la productividad de las empresas. Esa referencia que teníamos hace un año, luego a lo largo del estudio que ha estado desarrollando Miquel Navarro, también se nos citaba entonces a la misma fuente como referencia en lo que eran los procesos de medición de la innovación y como referencia internacional a la hora de alguna manera, de guiar el proceso de monitorización de políticas, programas y proyectos de innovación. Hoy realmente es un placer tener con nosotros y contamos con MacAulay, que es el representante de Nexta, responsable del proyecto Innovation Index, que precisamente le hemos invitado para que nos cuente qué es lo que se está haciendo a nivel de Reino Unido en todos estos asuntos y poder aprender y poder imitar la labor que están haciendo en este país que podemos definir claramente como líderes en estos aspectos de medición de la innovación. Brian, it's our great pleasure to come with your intervention today. We are really very interested on this question of the intangibles of innovation. Also, very recently you have published an innovation annual report for UK. So thank you again so much for you to be here, and we're anxious to hear your intervention. No, yet.
Right, well, just setting up the presentation. Firstly, my thanks to Innovación for the very kind invitation and hospitality shown since my arrival yesterday. It's good to be back in the Basque Country. I had a very nice time here when I was here in September, so I'm very pleased that such a positive response to the work that we're doing at Nesta. Just wanted to sort of talk about the Innovation Index. We set ourselves 4 goals, and I'm going to be talking principally about the first 2 of those, but I just wanted to sort of provide an overview of the broader measures. Nesta set itself a significant challenge, measuring the innovation that matters as the sort of byline to the presentation. Nesta, in about 2006-2007, published a report called the Innovation Gap, in which we identified that using traditional measures of innovation, the UK performs relatively badly against our European and international partners in the economies. But we didn't feel that that was actually a true reflection of the innovation that actually goes on within the UK economy, an economy which services in particular are playing an ever-increasing role. Much of the measurement of innovation traditionally has been focused on research and development and patents, the scientific arm of innovation. But there is clearly innovation that goes on which enables companies to become competitive, to be adaptive to changing situations, to develop new products and services which fall outside the remit of scientific measurement and R&D. We termed that broadly hidden innovation, innovation that happens within companies, within organisations, that enables them to be competitive, to develop new ideas for new products and services or improved products and services, to actually be able to develop the resources necessary to see those ideas come to market and then be successful in commercialising them. So we set ourselves the challenge to provide a better measurement of this. And the 4 goals that we set ourselves here is that an index should actually, firstly, measure the level of investment in innovation, the wider measure of innovation. And Carlos rightly highlighted the importance that investment in intangible assets plays in innovation. This is something which is being reviewed and explored internationally in the US, across the OECD and across Europe. So we're very pleased to be an important part of that. Secondly, and probably most importantly for the policy environment that we found ourselves in the UK, is measuring the contribution that innovation actually has to productivity. Innovation is the fundamental driver of the productivity, we believe, and we feel that we've demonstrated through our work the importance of innovation, the importance of ensuring that innovation prospers for productivity, because in the absence of a growing population, in the absence of the ability to scale up capital, the ability to generate increases in productivity is going to come from the ingenuity of the companies and organisations and the people that make them up. So innovation is going to be very important there. A third area that we developed with regards to our pilot, this is a 2.5-year programme. We're actually reaching the conclusion of the project now with the publication of the annual innovation report. As part of the pilot, we sought to develop a new way of measuring, or an improved way of measuring the innovation that actually goes on within businesses. So traditionally, the Community Innovation Survey is an established survey across the European community for measuring innovative activity. It's a very important survey, but what we found was that it didn't actually enable us to capture the innovation that goes on within businesses, actually under the organisational level, because it measured activity and measured attitudes and had some measures of expenditure, but didn't actually allow us to understand the drivers that go on within companies. And secondly, it's a standard instrument, a standard questionnaire that's applied across all sectors. So it didn't reflect the diversity and differences between sectors and what might be driving those. Now, I'm not going to be talking I'm not really going to be talking about it today because it was part of the pilot, but of course I'm happy to sort of communicate offline with anybody that's interested in knowing more about that. And fourthly, and this relates to what Carol was saying, which I think I understood part of because I could read the charts, but the important here about the wider conditions for innovation, because it isn't necessarily just the R&D and just the innovative capability within businesses and organisations, but the environment within which they operate. Now, as an economist, I can rationalise these different hierarchies of innovative measurements by saying that we have an important macro measurement, we have an important micro measurement, but where the micro and the macro meet, that's the meso, the environment within which they operate, and that's something which we think is very important. But as I said, I'm going to focus very much on the first two. A final thing which I'm going to touch upon, but probably won't have much time to go into it, it's something we're due to publish imminently, is a measurement of innovation within the public sector. Developing a survey instrument that will allow us to measure innovative capabilities within public sector organisations. So, just focusing on these first two. As I said, innovation is an important driver of economic growth. Now, the diagram there is a functional model, functional systems model of how Nesta sees innovation. We recognise it's a simplification, but it's a simplification because we want to communicate the dynamic nature that innovation, the processes through which innovation happens, but not through an institutional model, because obviously different institutional frameworks will apply in different economies, but by applying this simple functional model, we can see the interrelationship between each of these elements, we can see the dynamic nature. And a colleague of mine coined a very nice little soundbite that says, innovation has no first step. So this is a continuous process. It's really difficult to find one point and then follow it through. It's all very much interchangeable. The rationale for this, innovation is the most important of economic growth, and I'll demonstrate that in terms of the measurement in the UK. A parallel piece of work that we did at Nesta, which we just updated, a minority of high growth innovative businesses are vital to the economy. We published a piece of work called the Vital 6%, which found that 11,500 companies in the UK, which represent 6% of the UK business base, represented or contributed to over half the employment growth between 2000 and 2007. We've just updated that with an added dimension that many of these exhibited credit scorings, which meant that banks technically would not have invested or contributed money to them during the recession. So we've highlighted that these growth companies continue to be important in terms of driving employment growth and productivity growth in the UK. And thirdly here, the rationale for this is that governments across Europe and across the world see that we need to foster economic growth. We've gone through 2.5 years of very difficult economic and financial downturn in the UK. We're coming out of this relatively slowly, but innovation is going to play a significant part in driving us forward in terms of sustainable growth. Scholars pointed out that the Innovation Index has received what we might call official approval, in that we, alongside BIS, which is the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, the UK Industry Department, Business Department, we co-authored the Annual Innovation Report. It's a departure from previous reports, which were very much about highlighting the innovation activities that go on across UK government departments. This is very much an objective review of data highlighting the innovative position, capabilities within the UK. The index is a very central part of that. Okay. And we aim to update the macro measurements, which I'm going to go through now, annually, as a way of informing how the UK is performing on these measures of intangible assets. So, the framework for measuring investments in intangible assets was developed in the US, and it's been adopted, say, by a number of academics and research organisations across the world. Where Nesta has made significant advances is by taking the framework and moving beyond the established assumptions that have been underpinning that framework to improve the measurement of those by piloting new surveys to measure the expenditures, the investments that businesses make in intangible assets. Now, as I said, the Community Innovation Survey has aspects of it which ask for expenditures, but it's very difficult to identify which of those expenditures are actually linked to the intangible categories themselves. So we developed a questionnaire in partnership with the UK Office for National Statistics. It's an investment in intangible asset survey, so it does exactly what it says on the tin. We actually sent it out to 2,000 businesses in the UK, and we asked them to report on the levels of investments of each of those categories. So the categories are R&D, design, organisational capability, so business strategies, skills through training, market research and branding, so the commercialisation of new ideas, and also copyright, intellectual property assets. In a departure, we also asked them to report on the expenditures where they actually purchase services from other companies, but also to report how much they did in-house, because a lot of the investment actually comes from their own use of internal resources. So software is very much an example of that. So the UK, along with other national economies, now measure software both in terms of purchased and in-house by applying a methodology of estimating how much money would have been spent by businesses in terms of developing their own software capability. So we included questions on that to test how much of this was actually in-house. And a further aspect, which we think is new, we think only one other survey has actually done this, is that if you are treating these intangible investments as investments, clearly they have productive capability over 1 year, but that capability will start to depreciate over time. At the moment we use in the UK, as I'm sure across other economies, an assumed level of depreciation rates. But in this survey we actually asked companies to estimate how long they thought they would benefit from the investments that they were undertaking. And that then gave us an opportunity to test the depreciation rates. As you'd expect, a depreciation rate of an intangible is much faster than that of a tangible, a physical capital. But we had opportunities to identify that R&D, for example, estimated to contribute in terms of output capability for about 4 to 6 years, which is quite significant. The average is around about 3.5 years, which again reinforces our view that we should treat the expenditure in these as investments and not just as expenditures, not just as something that is consumed at the time. So that was a way of us improving the accuracy of our measurement. So what were the results of our latest survey? UK invested £137 billion in intangible assets in 2008, slightly down on figure for 2007 because we actually in here have the first 2 quarters of the recession in the UK. We can see that the largest component there is organisational innovation, actually investing in the sort of wider innovation if it was captured through the Community Innovation Survey. We can see that R&D is still a significant category of investment, £16 billion. But organisational innovation and training account for over a third, maybe 40% of that total. This represents nearly 14% of private sector output. We've excluded the government, which is obviously an important sector in terms of output, but we've excluded that. So this is 13.8% of private sector output. And we can see that we can track this over time. So we can look back to well, the data actually goes back to about 1970, but we've just obviously reported from about 1990 using this. One thing I would highlight is this issue of, there you go, I like these things, other forms, copyright. You can see that's about 4 billion. Our intellectual property office obviously feel that this doesn't accurately reflect the scale of investments in these areas, particularly if we take the UK as a leading economy in terms of the creative industries, through film, through music, and so forth. They've commissioned work, which we'll be reporting soon, which they feel that this is actually understating by a scale of maybe 4 to 5 times. So we will probably report, including the findings of their work, and highlight the even more important element of investments in intangibles. So what does that mean in terms of the innovation gap? Well, the latest data for the UK suggests that in terms of business R&D, it represents only 1.1% of overall GDP. Now, that's overall GDP, so of course, it has within that the government sector. But we can see that against our leading competitor economies, we're actually relatively low down. Now, we didn't feel that this is a true reflection if we look at the service sector within the UK economy, which accounts for about 75 to 80%. That's not necessarily renowned for high levels of R&D. If we apply the intangibles measure, and sometimes this is greeted with a degree of scepticism, saying, well, haven't you just chosen a measure that puts you top? No, that's not what we're sort of saying at all. What we're highlighting here is that the contribution that intangible investments in intangible assets has on the UK economy. I mean, with the 1.1%, one could argue that in terms of productivity, while we're not investing the same in R&D, the scale of output in terms of productivity is higher, so we're actually getting more for each pound. But here, what it highlights, I think what's very important, is the sort of breakdown of the types of investments in intangible assets. So we have the traditional measure, which is in the darker shade, which is your R&D design, intellectual property, of which is significant. But the more significant part is in the economic competencies, to use the framework definition. Here we will term this as the hidden innovation. The organisational capability, the training, the go-to-markets, the things that service companies as well as traditional production companies will undertake. And software development, again, is important. We do caveat this chart by pointing out that it does relate to different economies in different years, and the denominator used is slightly different. So I'll just point to that as a caveat so that the results aren't interpreted, but still signifies that the UK performance is important in this area. So what about the contribution that innovation has to productivity? there is an innovation gap. The UK, while the gap is closed against leading economies, there still is this gap, and this is obviously an issue that the UK government sought to address over many years. What is the role that contribution that innovation can have in closing this gap? And this is where the index comes out into its own. I won't bore you with methodologies unless there's an economist out there who wants to talk about this afterwards, but you take those investments in intangible assets, and there are resources that help the economy grow. So there is capital, there is labour in terms of increasing the amount of labour, but also labour gets better at what it does. So it enhances that through labour quality. But now, well, traditionally, the models would really just rely on that. They would just rely on capital and labour, and then the bit that you didn't have, the bit that wasn't reflected in that, was total factor productivity. Sometimes we refer to this as a sort of the unknown of this. But what we've done is say, well, actually, investments in intangible assets, we can recognise them, they're internally consistent with this, and we can break that down and see now how much of the productivity stems from these investments. And it's significant here, 0.51 percentage points of the 2.24 percentage point labour productivity growth in the UK. So that means that the UK has grown every year 2.25% 2008. This is slightly down on the average rate between 2000 and 2007. But in the annual innovation report, you'll see that there's a reference there to how the index actually allows us to see the importance of investments in intangibles as softening the impact of the downturn in productivity, which has been caused by quite a significant drop in output, even in that second half of 2008. Clearly in 2009, we're going to see a significant decline in output. But what's interesting is how has innovation softened that impact and enabled us to go forward. But if you combine the investments in innovation and the wider benefits of innovation, the total factor productivity, it comes to 63%. So really 2/3 of productivity growth in the UK, labour productivity growth, comes from innovation. Clearly allowing us to reach rightly the conclusion that innovation is the most significant driver. Now, a development that we've done in this report, which hasn't made it into the annual innovation report, but is in one of our reports, which isn't on your sheet, but I'm sure I can send you a link round, is to look at the innovation that happens within different sectors. So here we see the productivity growth in labour, annual productivity growth in labour between 2000 and 2007. It's 1 year behind, and the data source is different. This is EU CLEMS data, which covers all of the economies, certainly European 15. But what we see here is that retail and hotels and transport, productive sectors, but also importantly manufacturing. A lot of discussion in the UK about rebalancing, a lot of discussion about increasing the importance and role that manufacturing has in driving sustainable economic growth. But this is demonstrating that manufacturing continues to be an important sector where productivity growth occurs. Now, while employment may have fallen, clearly in some cases that actually makes an industry more productive because better use of technology, better combinations of capital and labour. But what does the intangibles framework tell us about how this productivity has occurred? Well, the first is to look at the role of ICT. So the elements there show the contributions that ICT have. And it's clear that ICT is very important to financial services, as one would expect. It represents a significant component of the productivity gains. Not so much for manufacturing. Again, that might be intuitive in terms of the types of ICT. So there will be ICT in terms of capital equipment, but not necessarily in terms of computers and those desktops and that used by business services and financial services. What about the contribution that intangible capital has had? The index reinforces the view that intangibles are important to the service sector. So we can see here that 0.54 significant part of the productivity growth in business services. What is very interesting for us is that it's also a very important driver for manufacturing. So this is indicating to us that manufacturers in the UK are continuing or are investing in intangibles. Why is that? Well, with further research we may be able to identify much more of what is contributing to this. But one aspect of this is the servitization of manufacturing. The manufacturers are increasingly applying services to their products. So the classic example is Rolls-Royce. It's, you no longer buy the engine per se, but you buy the diagnostic and so forth. And there's an interesting statistic that the UK Engineers Employers Federation put out, I think it saw that 2/3 of manufacturers now have some sort of service attached to their output. So this is a sort of indication that this may actually be captured in the productivity measurement. So if we look at financial services, there's actually a slightly strange one. It's a negative effect on financial services, but we think this is down to the fact that hours increase much more rapidly than output. Moving to sort of what are the drivers of innovation in these key sectors. Here we see, for example, financial services, TFP plays the largest part, around about 90% of driving productivity. But when we actually look at manufacturing, it's a bit more of an equal balance of this one. So manufacturing draws on all elements of the innovation framework. Financial services benefits more in terms of our measurement here, driven more by the spillovers that are generated through these investments. I only want to sort of just touch on this because of time, but we've also developed an instrument for measuring innovation in the public sector. We discussed at length the approach that we would adopt in terms of measuring this, and we moved towards a survey tool, but with an added aspect to it, in the sense that it's a survey tool that's administered through a telephone survey, but it enables us to provide the organisations that respond to the survey with a scorecard, so that they can actually see their performance relative to others within their sector and similar things. So this is the sort of framework that we have, and it's very similar to the framework that's developed for the private sector, in the sense that there is innovation activity and capability within that. So what are private sector companies, like private sector organisations, are actually doing? What is the impact of this on performance? And what are the wider conditions? So that sort of, what's going on within the organisations, how is that being reflected in terms of the outputs that they're generating, and the wider conditions. We are due to publish the findings of this in the next week or so, so I'll certainly share that with you. But I wanted to just sort of highlight how we're testing this. So each organisation that we actually surveyed trusts, NHS trusts within the UK NHS, of which there are 300 or so, or 160 or so, and also local authorities. So the actual organisation level is much higher than you would do for a business survey, which is why you might see that the actual levels of innovative activity are quite high when you compare them to private sector companies. But each of the respondents will receive their own scorecard based upon how they compare in each of those dimensions of the framework against similar organisations. Now this will allow them to be able to measure their performance and see where they might need to develop. So we have two things. We have one, a questionnaire that then allows us to scale up and measure the sector, but we also are providing the respondents with information, management information that they can use to improve their capabilities. And as I said, that's something that will be published in the next few days. And on that, I think I will sort of finish. Thank you so much.